Hi, I appreciate you joining me today. Gary Zacharias here, and you're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. There's a really wonderful book out by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And I've done Revelation, and I did chapter 5 on this one before, which is looking at the Old Testament narratives. How about we look at the epistles? That's chapters 3 and 4. And basically, this is what they call a practical approach to Bible study in an easy-to-understand style. And I think that's true. It's sold very, very well. It's been around a long time. I have a third edition, which, let's see what the date. This is probably pretty old, 2003. So I bet they've got a newer edition that you could find. But even though I tend to focus on apologetics books, for heaven's sakes, we need to know what the Bible says. So that's part of our theology as well as our apologetics, right? What does it say? And then defending it. So we want to know what it says. Well, these two authors say in chapter 3, as they start in, they said there are all sorts of genres in the Bible, right? You've got apocalyptic literature, and you've got poetry, and you've got stories, and you've got epistles, right? The New Testament letters. So they said they're going to start here. They've done some other things in the first two chapters. And they want to start here, right? This is where they're going to first look at a particular genre or way of writing in the Bible, and it's going to be an epistle. And they said they appear so easy to interpret. He said, gee, who needs special help to understand that all have sinned, like it says in Romans, or the wages of sin is death. That's also Romans 6. And by grace you've been saved through faith. That's Ephesians 2. But he says, I keep wanting to say it was Fee and Stewart. So they also say that can be actually deceptive, especially when you're trying to figure out how does that apply to us today. So things like if you take 1 Corinthians, I think that's chapter 5, it talks about excommunicating a brother. And so the two authors say, well, today you excommunicate somebody that's walked down the street and they go to another church. They said, what about chapters 12 to 14, if you're in a local church where the gifts of the Spirit are not accepted as valid for the 21st century? How do you get around the implication, they ask, in 1 Corinthians 11, where women are supposed to wear a head covering when they're praying and prophesying? Or the clear implication that they do get to pray and prophesy in a gathering of worship. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. We think of the letters as pretty simple, especially when we're dealing in apologetics issues, but they're not as easy to interpret as is often thought. So, and they're hugely important to the Christian faith. I mean, you have a pastor, and he's going to be going through a lot of the letters of Paul and John and Peter and all. So, what they're going to do is look especially at 1 Corinthians as a model for how to figure out and dig out the meaning of an epistle. But they said, let's start with just kind of a big picture of epistles and what they are. So they point out that those letters are not homogeneous. They're not. Somebody said that you could actually distinguish between letters and epistles. And the former, the real letters, as one person called them, were non-literary. They really weren't written for the public and posterity, just for the person to whom they were addressed. But in contrast to that, you've got epistles. So what are epistles? Well, this is the way they define it: an artistic, literary form or a species of literature that was intended for the public. Okay, so they're quoting a person here who thinks all of the Pauline epistles as well as 2nd and 3rd John are real letters. Right? And somebody says, what about Romans and Philemon? They said that, well, they're different from each other, not only in the content, but one seems far more personal than the other. Philemon is very personal, isn't it? I mean, Paul's talking to a brother who has had a slave who's run away, Onesimus, and is in Paul's territory now, and Paul's writing this letter. It's a wonderful letter. I wish more time was devoted to Philemon. I love reading that. But I tell you, Paul is a master of working people, getting him to do what he wants them to do. Whereas Romans is far more carefully structured, and it's far more abstract in a sense. It lacks that personal touch. And they said, in contrast to any of Paul's letters, 2 Peter and 1 John are far more like epistles. Okay, so I said, let's take a look at the form of ancient letters. Like today, we put a date up on the top, and then we have a salutation, dear madam, dear sir, whatever. And then we have a body, then we have a closing, and then we have a signature. But they had their own form of doing an epistle. So they said they found thousands of ancient letters, and most of them have a form just like the ones in the New Testament. And they usually had 6 parts. So first was the name of the writer, I, Paul, or whoever. The name of the recipient, to the Church of God in Corinth, for example. A greeting. How's Corinthians get going? Grace and peace to you from God our Father. And then a prayer, wish, or thanksgiving. I always thank God for you. And then number 5 is the body of the letter. And then a final greeting and farewell. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you. So one more time, 6 parts. The name of the writer, who's the recipient, the greeting, the prayer, wish, or thanksgiving, the body, and then a final greeting and farewell. So it said the one thing that seems to be kind of variable in this form of 6 items is number 4, which is that prayer wish. It said sometimes it's missing, like it's not in Galatians, it's not in 1 Timothy, it's not in Titus. But sometimes you'll find a thanksgiving and a prayer in some of Paul's letters. And they said that in 3 of the New Testament epistles, the thanksgiving turns into a doxology. Look in 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, and 1 Peter. So they said if you look at the New Testament epistles that lack either those formal elements 1 to 3, naming the writer and the recipient and the greeting, or maybe they're missing number 6, the final greeting, are those that fail to be true letters, although they do look like the form, like Hebrews. Somebody said Hebrews is described as 3 parts tract and 1 part letter, and it was sent to a specific group of people. 1 John is similar, they said, in some ways, except it has none of the formal elements of a letter, but it's clearly written for a specific group of people. Look in 1 John 2:7 and 1 John 2:12 to 14 and 19 and 26. It looks like the body of a letter with all the formal elements ripped away. James and 2 Peter, they're both addressed as letters, but they lack that familiar final greeting and farewell. They lack specific addresses. They're the closest thing to epistles, in other words, for the whole church. Although they said 2 Peter seems to have been called forth by someone who is denying Christ's second coming. You can see that in 2 Peter 3. So they said there are a variety of kinds, but they said there's one thing that all the epistles have in common, and it's the crucial thing to note when you're reading and trying to figure them out. They all are what are technically called occasional documents, meaning they came out of and they were intended for some kind of special occasion, and they're all from the 1st century. Okay, so it says you got to keep in mind the occasional nature. So they were brought forth because of some special circumstance, either from the reader's side or the author's side. They said, if you'll notice, almost all of the New Testament letters came about because of the reader's side. Said the exceptions might be Philemon to that, and maybe James and Romans. So usually there's some kind of behavior going on, and Paul, for example, is going, oh, good grief, you Galatians, what are you doing? So there was some kind of behavior that needed correcting, or maybe there's a doctrinal error that they looked at and said, whoa, wait a minute, we got to straighten this out. Or maybe a misunderstanding that needed further light. So they said, many of our problems, when we're trying to sit there and read an epistle, our problem comes because we're not aware of this occasion. We have answers, but we don't know what the question or the problems were. So I said, we've got to try to, in a sense, hear the other end, they say, so that we know what our passage is a response to. Okay, then they make one further point. The occasional nature of these epistles means they're not, first of all, theological treatises, and they're not really summaries of Paul's or Peter's theology. Oh, sure, they said there is theology implied, but it's always theology having to do with whatever the task is at hand. They said that's even true of Romans. You think about that as being heavily theological, and it is more full, and it's really a systematic statement of Paul's theology, more than you find elsewhere, but it's only some of his theology. Okay, it's his task. He's an apostle to the Gentiles. So what's he doing in Romans? Paul's trying to struggle in a way to get the Jews and Gentiles to become one people of God based on grace and not law. And so that's what he's talking about there. So we get the word justify. That's in Romans 15 times and in Galatians 8 times, but it's only used 2 other times in all of Paul's other letters. So I said, people go to the epistles again and again for Christian theology. Sure, they're loaded with it, the authors say. But you got to keep in mind that they were not primarily written to expound Christian theology. It's always theology. This is important, I think. It's always theology that's applied to or directed towards some kind of particular need. Okay, so they said, let's do a case study of 1 Corinthians. They said they know not every epistle is like it, but it's going to cover a lot of the basics here. So they start off, they said, well, the first thing you want to do when you're reading an epistle is try to get some kind of reconstruction of the situation that the author is speaking to. So in this case, what was going on in Corinth? Why would Paul write 1 Corinthians? So they said, how's he come to learn of their situation? What attitudes do the Corinthians and Paul, but how do they reflect in this letter? So they said, good idea is start with a Bible dictionary or some kind of introduction to a commentary that you have to find out about Corinth and its people. So what are you going to find out? Well, Corinth was a relatively young city. It was only 94 years old when Paul first visited it, but it was located in such a great place for commerce. It was wealthy. It was known as a patron of the arts. It was religious. Boy, there were temples, something like 26 temples and shrines, and unfortunately is well known for sensuality. So they said, think about it this way, it's a little bit of New York, L.A., and Las Vegas all wrapped up in one place. Wow. Yeah, I'm glad I don't live in the combo of New York, L.A., and Las Vegas, but that's what Corinth was. So they said, this is not going to look like some kind of letter to a community church in the middle of Arkansas or Kansas or Iowa, anything like that. So keep in mind this background. Okay, so first, you're finding out about the people of Corinth. Then they said second, says you need to develop of reading the whole letter through in one sitting. Oh man, I think that is so useful. It says it's going to take you an hour, maybe more, but nothing can ever substitute. It says that's the way you read every other letter. A letter of the Bible shouldn't be any different. There's some things you should be looking for as you read, but you're not going to try to grasp the meaning of every word or sentence. You're trying to get the big view first. They said they can't stress enough the importance of reading and rereading. So they said, once you've kind of figured out the letter and you've divided it into logical parts and sections, then begin the study of every section the same way. Read and reread and keep your eyes open. And learn to read aloud whenever you can. It says as you read through the whole letter, you may find it helpful to maybe jot down a few really brief notes, and they emphasize really brief notes, with references if you have a hard time making mental notes. So what kinds of things would you write down? Well, you're trying to reconstruct the problem, right? What's Paul dealing with? So number one, they said these are 4 kinds of notes you might want to take. Number one, what do you notice about the people that are going to get the letter, their problems and their attitudes, and maybe even how wealthy they are? Number 2, what's Paul's attitude as you're reading through the letter? Number 3, any specific things that are mentioned for that occasion of the letter? And number 4, look for the letter's natural logical divisions. And by the way, I can't remember if they picked that up in this chapter, but I'm sure these 2 authors, Fee and Stewart, would agree that as you're reading through these letters and you're looking for the natural divisions, keep in mind that the Bible that we have was chopped up into chapters and verses a long time ago. And I know for myself, I'll be reading, if I pick out one chapter to look at and the chapter starts, therefore, I'm thinking, wow, I probably really should have started in the previous chapter because Paul has made some kind of key point in the previous chapter, and he expects you to hook that to the new section, which is going to be saying as a result of what I just told you. But if we just read that one chapter without the previous one, we're going to miss all of that. So really, really important to know the logical divisions, not necessarily what our Bibles tell us are the divisions. So they said if that's too much to do at one sitting, maybe read first and then go back and skim read to pick up some of those items. So they said, let's take a look. What do you notice in Corinthians? Grouping those four categories. Number one, what did you notice about the recipients? Well, the Corinthians, the believers, they were Gentiles. There were some Jews, but they loved wisdom and knowledge. They're proud and they're arrogant, and they even judged Paul. Yet they have a large number of internal problems. What about number two? What were the attitudes of Paul? His attitudes, sometimes he's rebuking and kind of frustrated. Sometimes he's exhorting them. How about number three? What about the specific occasion? It says if you look at chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, verses 10 to 12, Paul says he's been informed by people from Chloe's household. And in 5:1, it talks about some more information. And then in 7:1, he says, now for the matters you wrote about, which means he also got a letter. And if you look at chapter 7, 8, 12, 16, he says, now about, right? So in other words, he's referring to items from the letter. He's taking them up one at a time. So take a look also. Did you notice the arrival of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus in 1617? Since Stephanas is to be submitted to, these men are probably leaders in the church. Maybe they're the ones that brought the letter to Paul. It's kind of like an official delegation. So these two authors say, if you didn't catch all of that, don't give up. It said, we've gone over this more than once, but you want to read with your eyes open to pick up these kinds of clues. Okay, then let's go to number 4. What are the logical divisions? It says, now the important matter. Have a working outline of the letter. It says it's really important in 1 Corinthians. It says it's easier to study or read the letter in small, bite-sized packages. So it says, begin with the obvious major divisions. They said, take a look at 7:1, chapter 7, verse 1. That's the big clue. Paul's mentioning their letter to him. And since in chapter 1 and chapter 5, he mentions items reported to him, we can assume that everything from chapters 1 to 6 are the things that got reported to him. Okay? So what kinds of things got reported to him in the first 6 chapters? Well, in chapters 1 to 4, it's division in the church. In chapter 5, we got an incestuous man. Chapter 6, beginning of 6, what do we have? Lawsuits. Believers are suing each other. And then a little bit later in 6, starting with chapter 6, verse 12 to 20, we got sexual immorality. So it says we already noticed we got clues in chapters 7 to 16. They start with things like now about. Okay, so he talks about that. So I'm going to skip over some of that. It says you can outline, actually, the rest of the letter. Paul says now about, okay, so we're in chapter 7, behavior within marriage, about virgins. Chapter 8, about food sacrificed to idols. Chapter 11, covering women's heads in worship. Also in 11, abusing the Lord's Supper. Chapters 12 to 14, spiritual gifts. Chapter 15, the bodily resurrection of believers. Boy, that's good news, isn't it? 16, collection. And also in 16, the return of Apollos. And then finally, the concluding exhortations and the greetings. Okay, so they said, before we go on, they said there are a couple of things you should notice. The only other place in Paul's letter where he takes up this big list of independent items is in 1 Thessalonians 4 to 5. They said for the most part, Paul's other letters are just like one long argument, although sometimes he breaks it into pieces. And they said also, keep in mind, this is just a tentative outline. So I said, what we really want to know is what was the precise nature of each of the problems in Corinth. And so that's what they're going to do. They're just going to take the division of the church, that's chapters 1 to 4, and break that down. So I think I'll skip over that because I don't want to go into so much detail on 1 Corinthians. I just wanted you to get the idea of what they're saying are good approaches when you're reading epistles. And then they said the next step when you're studying an epistle is to learn to trace Paul's arguments. Well, how do you do that? They said, we can't stress enough the importance of your learning to, and here they have it capitalized, think paragraphs. and not just as natural units of thought, but the absolutely necessary key to understanding the arguments in the epistles. So the one question you have to be asking yourself over and over again, they say, is, what's the point? So they said you need to be able to do two things. One, in a compact way, what's the content of each paragraph? What is Paul saying? And number two, why do you think Paul says it right at this point? How does this content contribute to the argument? Okay, and then they go back to Corinthians, and I think I'll skip over that. And so they're just telling you pretty much a conclusion at the end there. I'm going to skip ahead here. They said, we've led you through some passages, said you could have done that on your own. But they said, hey, here we go. They said there are some bizarre areas in some of the epistles where people scratch their heads. It said things like, because of the angels in 1 Corinthians 11, what's that about? Or 1 Corinthians 15, being baptized for the dead. Or what about 1 Peter 3? It talks about Christ preaching to the imprisoned spirits. What? Or the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2. So what are they saying here? How do you go about finding the meaning of problem passages? And they give you a few points, which I think are really good. Number one reason the texts are so hard is that they weren't written to us, right? We're kind of looking at somebody else's letter. Okay. But they said, what God wants us to know, he's communicated to us. What he has not told us may hold our interest, but we may be uncertain at these points, right? We don't want to be dogmatic about them. And then number two, now we are uncertain on some of the precise details, but what you want to do is to ask what could be said for certain about a text, and then what's just merely possible but not certain about, for example, the baptism of the dead. And number three, even if you don't have complete certainty about some of the details, very often the big point of the whole passage is still something that you can grasp. So this thing about baptizing for the dead, whatever it was they were doing, we know why Paul referred to this practice. Their own action was a kind of proof from experience that they were not consistent in their rejecting a future bodily resurrection of believers. And number four, if you're dealing with these tough passages, you need a good commentary. The good ones will list and give you different options. They won't tell you this is the right one necessarily. It says you may not always go along with their choices, but you need to be informed about the variety of options that are out there. And good commentaries will do that for you. So that was chapter 3 about dealing with the epistles, learning to think contextually, they say. Well, I hope you get a feel for this because we want to do good Bible reading. We want to get a lot out of it. And today I don't think people are, they still may read their Bibles, but I'm not sure they're getting deep information out of them and making it part of their lives. So I like the book a lot. It's called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And I hope you have a chance to look at that, or hope you have a good commentary or two at home that'll help you get through some of these tough passages. Okay, well, thanks for being part of our podcast today.